Before smooth highways and clear signposts existed, people traveled on roads that were little more than beaten paths, narrow, unpredictable, and shaped entirely by weather, terrain, and time. In the Middle Ages, every journey carried a degree of uncertainty. Roads washed out after storms. Forest routes twisted without warning. Mountain tracks narrowed into unsafe edges. And travelers, from merchants to messengers, often had only their judgment to rely on. Tonight, we're going to take a quiet, careful walk through those roads, how people used them, why they were risky, and how travelers learned to move through a world where safety depended on experience rather than infrastructure. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if you had to travel one medieval route, forest, mountain, or riverside, which would you choose and why? Your answers help guide future stories. And if you enjoy these calm history journeys, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you never miss another peaceful step into the past. Now let's begin. The dangerous roads of the Middle Ages. When examining the roads of the Middle Ages, it becomes clear that their dangers stemmed not from a single issue, but from the combined effect of geography, limited engineering, irregular maintenance, and the practical constraints of pre-modern life. Medieval roads were not designed for comfort, speed, or long-distance travel. Rather, they developed organically over generations, shaped by repeated foot traffic, the movement of animals, the needs of local communities, and environmental conditions. They were functional enough for short-distance movement, but rarely optimized for heavy loads or unfamiliar travelers. Understanding why medieval roads were difficult to navigate requires looking closely at how these roads were formed, how they were maintained, and how people adapted to using them. The earliest medieval roads were often simple tracks beaten into the landscape. These tracks emerged spontaneously as villagers, farmers, traders, and herders moved between fields, markets, and neighboring settlements. Repetition carved depressions in the ground, flattening grass, compacting soil, and gradually producing a recognizable path. These tracks were rarely straight. They wound around obstacles such as boulders, streams, marshes, thickets, or private land. Over time, certain paths became more commonly used, and these dominant tracks served as the backbone of local mobility. Travelers did not choose these routes because they were safe. They chose them because they were familiar and had become part of local routines. One of the defining features of medieval roads was the lack of consistent width or structure. A road could begin broad and firm near a town, then narrow suddenly as it entered farmland, becoming little more than a single path suitable only for foot travel. In some areas, the road split into multiple parallel tracks because heavy cart wheels had carved deep ruts into the ground. When one rut became too deep or muddy, travelers simply began using a new parallel track, creating a cluster of paths that shifted slightly every season. This flexibility allowed movement in poor conditions, but made navigation confusing for anyone unfamiliar with the region. Without clear signage or markers, travelers frequently had to rely on local advice to avoid accidentally following a farm path instead of a main road. The surface quality of medieval roads varied dramatically. In dry seasons, many roads were reasonably passable. Firm earth, packed by repeated use, created a stable surface. But after rainfall, that same earth turned to mud. Heavy wagons sank, animals struggled, and ruts deepened rapidly. Even well-used roads could become temporarily impassable after storms. In colder regions, freeze-thaw cycles caused the ground to heave unevenly. Stones rose to the surface, creating tripping hazards and damaging wagon wheels. Travelers had to adjust constantly to changing conditions, slowing their pace or stopping altogether when conditions deteriorated. In some regions, roads passed through marshy or low-lying areas. Because medieval people lacked the engineering resources to construct raised embankments or drainage systems on a large scale, these areas were particularly troublesome. Water pooled easily, forming patches of standing water that remained for weeks. Travelers navigated these areas by stepping on higher ground, weaving between tufts of grass and firmer soil. Wagons risked becoming stuck, forcing merchants to unload goods temporarily or seek help from locals. Communities sometimes laid wooden planks or brush along the worst segments, but these makeshift solutions degraded quickly and required constant renewal. Another fundamental challenge came from the absence of standardized maintenance. Roads were considered public routes, yet no central authority existed to oversee them consistently. Responsibility for upkeep fell to local communities, whose resources and priorities varied widely. Some areas organized communal maintenance, requiring households to contribute labor at specific times of the year. Others relied on local landowners to maintain portions of the road passing through their property. However, such efforts were irregular. During busy agricultural seasons, maintenance ceased as communities focused on planting or harvesting. As a result, roads fell into disrepair precisely when travelers needed them most for moving goods to market. When maintenance did occur, it often addressed only the most severe issues. Workers might remove a fallen tree, fill a deep hole with loose gravel, or shore up a small wooden bridge temporarily. Long-term improvements were rare because they required time, manpower, and resources that many rural communities lacked. Only roads near major towns received more consistent attention, and even these remained modest by modern standards. Over long distances, travelers encountered abrupt shifts from reasonably maintained segments to neglected stretches that tested both endurance and equipment. Roads became especially difficult to navigate in forested regions, where visibility was reduced and the terrain proved uneven. Roots pushed up sections of the path, fallen branches created obstacles, and dense foliage obscured sight lines. Travelers had to proceed cautiously, listening for other travelers or animals before rounding bends. Forested paths also posed a challenge due to their narrowness. A single wagon struggling in mud could block the road entirely. Meeting another wagon coming from the opposite direction required maneuvering into the undergrowth or reversing long distances. These delays consumed valuable time and increased the risk of injury to both travelers and animals. In mountainous or hilly regions, roads often followed the natural contours of the terrain. Many medieval mountain routes were originally created by herders moving livestock, not by engineers designing safe passage. As a result, these paths were steep, narrow, and exposed. A wagon loaded with goods risked tipping on uneven slopes. In some areas, the path narrowed to the width of a single cart, forcing travelers to wait for oncoming wagons to pass before continuing. During rain, mountain roads became slick and stones loosened underfoot. Travelers navigated these paths slowly, aware that a misstep could lead to injury or a damaged cart, which was difficult to repair far from populated areas. River crossings introduced another layer of unpredictability. Permanent stone bridges were rare and expensive to construct. Many crossings relied on wooden bridges, vulnerable to rot, floods, and structural weakness. Some communities maintained simple plank bridges that provided basic crossing points, but these often deteriorated without warning. Other crossings used ferries or small boats operated by local ferrymen. These worked well in calm conditions, but were suspended during floods, storms, or fast-flowing currents. Travelers arriving at an unusable crossing had no choice but to wait, sometimes for days, until conditions improved. In areas without bridges or ferries, travelers forded rivers directly. Fording required judgment and experience. Even shallow rivers could hide deep holes or unstable ground. Water levels changed rapidly after rainfall, turning a manageable ford into a dangerous crossing. Merchants traveling with wagons had to assess whether wheels would sink or whether the current might sweep away goods or animals. Some roads bypassed fordable sections entirely during certain seasons, requiring lengthy detours. This meant that traveling at the wrong time of year dramatically increased the difficulty and duration of a journey. Beyond natural conditions, medieval roads were also shaped by human boundaries. Land ownership determined access, and property disputes sometimes led to rerouted or blocked paths. A noble could restrict passage through their land or charge travelers tolls. These tolls varied in amount and frequency, increasing expenses for merchants and complicating route planning. Travelers who attempted to avoid toll roads often found themselves on less maintained and more dangerous paths. This trade-off between safety and cost influenced decisions throughout every journey. The lack of signage contributed to navigational challenges. Modern travelers rely on markers, maps, and identifiers to orient themselves, but medieval travelers relied primarily on memory, local guidance, and physical landmarks. A large tree, a particular bend in a river, or the shape of a ridge served as navigational cues. When weather, seasonal changes, or natural disasters altered these landmarks, travelers found themselves disoriented. Travelers frequently asked locals for directions, but instructions varied depending on how familiar villagers were with the specific route. A villager might describe a path that appeared clear locally, but became confusing further along. In regions with heavy snowfall, winters created additional difficulties. Snow concealed ruts, stones, and holes, turning ordinary paths into hazardous terrain. Frozen rivers sometimes served as temporary routes, but only when the ice remained thick enough to support weight. Thawing conditions transformed roads into slush, slowing progress dramatically. Merchants adjusted their schedules accordingly, often avoiding long-distance travel during the harshest winter months. The condition of medieval roads also affected trade and communication. Goods traveled slowly due to road conditions, limiting the quantity and speed of commerce. Letters carried by messengers moved at the pace of a walking or riding traveler, with delays common during foul weather or road closures. Towns far from major routes remained more isolated, receiving fewer goods and less information. This isolation reinforced regional differences in goods, culture, and customs, making long-distance travel even more challenging for merchants encountering unfamiliar practices. Over time, communities and travelers developed coping strategies. Merchants scheduled their journeys during more predictable seasons. They learned which routes drained water better or remained firm despite frequent rain. They planned stops at villages known for hospitality or reliable maintenance. They adjusted wagon loads depending on road conditions, lighter loads for muddy seasons, heavier loads for dry periods. Such adaptations allowed merchants to continue traveling despite the inherent challenges of medieval roads. Yet, despite these adaptations, the structure and condition of the roads remained a central factor in shaping medieval travel. Every journey became an exercise in caution, patience, and practical judgment. Travelers understood that the terrain set the terms, not their own plans. The difficulties they faced were not extraordinary events, but everyday realities of life before modern engineering. Roads were unpredictable, imperfect, and often hazardous, but they were the essential pathways connecting communities, markets, and people. By looking closely at how medieval roads were formed and maintained, it becomes clear why they were considered dangerous. The dangers did not arise from sudden catastrophe, but from the routine challenges of navigating an environment shaped by natural forces and limited resources. For medieval travelers, safety depended on understanding these challenges and respecting the road's limitations. This awareness formed the foundation for the experiences and decisions described in later chapters, shaping how travelers approached every step of their journeys across the medieval landscape. For medieval travelers, the greatest risks on the road often came not from other people, but from the natural world. Weather shaped every mile of a journey. Rain could transform a manageable road into a deep mire. Weeks of drought could harden the ground into uneven surfaces that strained wagon wheels. Winter snow covered dangerous ruts and obscured familiar landmarks. In the Middle Ages, without modern drainage systems, accurate forecasting, or weather-resistant infrastructure, even slight changes in the environment significantly affected travel conditions. Understanding how nature influenced medieval roads reveals why travel required constant attention, patience, and a willingness to adapt. Rainfall was one of the most significant factors shaping road conditions. Medieval roads were largely unpaved, consisting of compacted soil that held up well under dry conditions, but deteriorated rapidly when wet. After even moderate rainfall, these roads absorbed water, creating mud of varying depth and consistency. Light mud slowed travel and forced travelers to take shorter steps or adjust the pace of animals. Heavy mud became far more disruptive. Wagons could sink so deeply that wheels became stuck, requiring travelers to unload goods temporarily or seek assistance from locals. In some areas, particularly where clay-rich soil dominated, roads turned into thick, sticky surfaces that clung to boots and hooves, making every movement laborious. Travelers often had to pause at the edges of these sections, analyzing whether to proceed, wait, or attempt to bypass through nearby fields, though such detours risked damaging crops or angering landowners. Rain also affected visibility. Medieval travelers had no streetlights, reflective markers, or maintained drainage channels. During storms, water pooled unpredictably, masking obstacles such as stones, holes, or sections of road where erosion had weakened the ground. Even experienced travelers misjudged the depth of puddles, stepping into holes that twisted ankles or damaged wheels. In forested areas, rain brought additional hazards. Water ran down slopes, washing soil and small branches onto the road. Slippery fallen leaves accumulated quickly, reducing traction for both boots and hooves. Branches loosened by wind fell without warning, sometimes blocking entire stretches of road. When rain persisted for days, its effects extended beyond mud and poor visibility. Rivers and streams swelled, overflowing their banks and flooding roads that crossed low-lying areas. These floods often lasted long after rainfall ceased because medieval roads lacked elevated construction or engineered drainage. Travelers approaching a flooded area faced a difficult choice: attempt a crossing through water whose depth was uncertain, detour to higher ground, which might add many additional miles, or wait nearby until waters receded. Flooding also carried debris, branches, stones, or even loose planks, which complicated crossings further. A merchant traveling with goods risked significant losses if water damaged textiles, food supplies, or metal tools. Dry conditions presented their own challenges. During long periods without rain, roads hardened and cracked. While dry, firm ground seemed beneficial at first glance, it caused unexpected problems. Hard soil magnified every bump and irregularity, transmitting vibrations through wagon wheels to the frame. Over time, these vibrations loosened bolts, shook joints apart, and weakened wooden components. Merchants had to stop periodically to tighten fastenings and inspect wagons for early signs of damage. Dust became an additional hazard in dry regions. Passing travelers raised clouds of dust that limited visibility, irritated eyes, and clogged animal nostrils. Dust also settled onto goods, particularly textiles or uncovered food items, reducing their quality and value at markets. Travelers frequently covered their loads with cloth or leather sheets to protect them from dust and debris. Wind, though less visibly dramatic than rain or snow, still posed risks for medieval travelers. Strong winds made it difficult for wagons to maintain balance on narrow or uneven roads. In open plains, crosswinds pushed against travelers unexpectedly, sometimes forcing them to stop until conditions improved. Wind increased the difficulty of traveling through forested areas by knocking loose branches or blowing leaves that obscured the path. It also influenced river crossings by creating choppy waters that ferrymen struggled to navigate. Travelers who underestimated the influence of wind risked accidents that delayed journeys or caused damage to goods. Fog and mist further complicated medieval travel. Without clear visibility, travelers relied heavily on sound and memory to navigate. Fog often formed in valleys, near rivers, or in marshy regions, places where roads were already difficult to follow. When visibility dropped to only a few steps ahead, travelers could easily stray from the road, stumble into ditches, or miss key landmarks. Fog also muffled sound, making it harder to detect approaching travelers, animals, or hazards. Merchants traveling in groups remained close together, speaking periodically to ensure no one drifted off the path. Solo travelers moved slowly and cautiously, sometimes choosing to wait for the mist to lift rather than continue blindly. Snow posed one of the most significant seasonal challenges. In regions with harsh winters, snow fell heavily and accumulated quickly. Roads disappeared beneath a uniform layer of white, erasing ruts, stones, and depressions that normally guided movement. Travelers had to rely on memory, the position of trees or fences, or distant landmarks to trace the correct path. Snowdrifts hid deep holes, roots, and uneven ground. Wagons bogged down in compacted snow unless teams of animals were strong enough to pull through. In particularly treacherous stretches, merchants abandoned wagons temporarily and carried only essential items until conditions improved. Ice created additional hazards. Frozen roads were slick and dangerous for animals pulling heavy loads. Hooves slipped easily, leading to injuries or forcing animals to move far more slowly. Wagons skidded, especially on slopes, straining harnesses and risking collisions with trees or rocks. In some regions, frozen rivers became temporary roads, offering smoother passage than muddy paths. However, merchants had to judge ice thickness carefully. Crossing too early or too late in winter risked breaking through the surface, which could lead to loss of goods, animals, or even life. Travelers often waited for local confirmation that the ice had consistently supported others before attempting such crossings. Spring introduced transitional hazards. Melting snow created waterlogged ground, turning roads into deep mud. Rivers swelled with meltwater, flooding crossings and washing away temporary bridges. The freeze-thaw cycle loosened stones and soil, causing small landslides along hillsides or mountains. Travelers were cautious during this season, knowing that the landscape changed rapidly and required careful observation. Spring also marked the beginning of increased travel for merchants preparing for early markets, intensifying road usage at a time when conditions were far from stable. Summer, though generally the most favorable season for travel, brought its own environmental challenges. Heat strained animals, especially those carrying heavy loads over long distances. Travelers sought shade during the hottest hours of the day, slowing their progress. Dehydration became a concern, particularly on long stretches between settlements where water sources were unreliable. Flies and other insects irritated animals, reducing their efficiency. Vegetation along the roads grew quickly during summer, narrowing paths and obscuring hazards. In forested regions, dry underbrush increased the risk of forest fires, which could close routes entirely or force travelers to make long detours. Storms during any season posed immediate threats. Lightning and strong winds made open areas risky, prompting travelers to seek shelter away from tall trees or exposed ridges. In the absence of designated shelters, travelers waited under rock overhangs or in simple roadside clearings, hoping the storm would pass quickly. Heavy storms damaged roads, uprooted trees, and triggered landslides in hilly regions. Merchants who encountered such conditions often paused their journeys to assess the aftermath before continuing. Animals contributed to environmental risks as well. Wild animals such as wolves, boars, or large deer lived near many roads, especially those that passed through forests or unpopulated areas. While attacks on humans were rare, animals could still startle horses or block paths unexpectedly. Merchants remained alert during early morning or evening hours when wildlife was most active. They also listened for distant sound cues, rustling leaves, snapping branches, or unusual silence that indicated nearby movement. Environmental conditions often determined the tempo of a journey. A road that was easy to travel in one season became treacherous in another. Travelers adjusted their pace accordingly. On dry, firm ground, they covered significant distances each day. In muddy or flooded areas, progress slowed dramatically. Merchants developed realistic expectations, knowing that inconsistency was a natural part of medieval travel. They built flexibility into their schedules to account for delays caused by weather or terrain. Nature's influence on roads also shaped the strategies travelers used to navigate safely. Merchants studied the sky for signs of changing weather. They learned how certain cloud formations predicted rain or storms. They recognized subtle differences in wind direction that signaled shifting conditions. They assessed soil firmness using experience gained from previous journeys. Listening to water flow helped them judge whether a river was rising or stable. These observational skills allowed travelers to make informed decisions that preserved safety and reduced the risk of sudden disaster. Communities along major routes developed an intuitive understanding of how weather affected road conditions. Villagers warned travelers about dangerous stretches or advised them when to delay crossings. Ferrymen refused to operate during storms, not out of reluctance, but based on long experience with the unpredictability of currents and wind. Inns near rivers sometimes filled quickly during flood seasons as travelers waited for safe conditions. These local responses formed an informal safety system, guided entirely by observation and community memory rather than formal infrastructure. Ultimately, the dangers of medieval roads stemmed not from extraordinary events, but from the routine interaction between travelers and the natural environment. Weather transformed familiar paths into unpredictable obstacles. Terrain shifted with each season. Rivers rose and receded. Forests changed shape with growth and decay. Travelers learned to respect these forces, adjusting their behavior to match conditions rather than expecting the landscape to accommodate them. This constant negotiation with nature defined medieval travel. It required patience, careful judgment, and a steady mindset. While modern travelers rely on engineered roads and accurate forecasts, medieval travelers relied on experience, local knowledge, and adaptability. Their awareness of environmental conditions shaped not only their routes and schedules, but their entire approach to the road. In this way, weather and the environment were not merely obstacles. They were integral components of the medieval travel experience, influencing decisions at every step and highlighting the practical realities of life in a world where nature set the terms for every journey. When studying medieval travel, it becomes clear that the most challenging parts of any journey were not necessarily the long distances or lack of infrastructure, but the major natural obstacles that stood between one destination and the next. Medieval people traveled through environments that were largely untouched by engineering, and much of the landscape presented difficulties that required caution, patience, and local knowledge. Among the most significant of these obstacles were rivers, swamps, and forests, three environmental conditions that shaped the experience of medieval travel and determined how, when, and whether travelers reached their destinations. Rivers were both valuable and dangerous. They served as natural boundaries, sources of water, and transportation routes, but they also created some of the most unpredictable and hazardous crossings. Only a small number of medieval towns possessed permanent stone bridges. These bridges, when available, were crucial assets, but they were costly to build and maintain, meaning they existed only in strategically important locations. Travelers approaching such bridges sometimes waited in long lines, particularly during market seasons, since people transporting goods, animals, or wagons all needed to cross. Even stone bridges were not immune to damage. Floods could undermine their foundations, storms could loosen stones, and heavy usage wore down surfaces. Travelers often approached bridges cautiously, examining the structure for signs of strain. More commonly, travelers relied on wooden bridges, which varied significantly in quality. Some were simple plank structures spanning narrow streams. Others were longer constructions with wooden supports driven into the riverbed. These bridges required constant maintenance. Wood rot, insect damage, and seasonal flooding created weaknesses that were not always visible at first glance. Travelers often listened to the sound of their wagon or footsteps crossing. Creaking or unusual vibrations signaled potential danger. In regions where maintenance lagged, bridges might partially collapse under weight, leading to damaged goods or injured animals. Even when intact, narrow bridges demanded careful maneuvering, especially for merchants with loaded wagons. In many places, there were no bridges at all, and travelers had to use fords, shallow points where the river could be crossed on foot or by wagon. These fords changed constantly with rainfall, seasons, and river flow. A ford safe in summer might become impossible to cross after days of rain. The bottom consisted of uneven stones, shifting mud, or slippery gravel. Travelers needed experience to judge whether a ford was passable. They watched how fast the water moved, assessed its depth with sticks, and sometimes waited for local residents to cross first. Animals, particularly horses or mules, hesitated at deep or fast-moving water, requiring coaxing or gradual entry. For merchants carrying goods easily damaged by water, textiles, metal items prone to rust, or food supplies, fording represented a significant risk that had to be weighed carefully. Some regions relied on ferries, especially where rivers were too deep or wide for fording. These ferries ranged from small rowboats for individual passengers to larger flat-bottomed boats capable of transporting wagons and animals. Ferrymen controlled these crossings, setting schedules based on daylight, weather, and river conditions. During strong winds, storms, or high water, ferries did not operate. Travelers who arrived during such conditions had to wait, sometimes for days, before the river became safe enough to cross. Because ferries were often privately operated, fees varied and could be significant for merchants traveling with heavy loads. Still, many travelers preferred ferries over uncertain fords, valuing their relative predictability. Beyond rivers, swamps and marshlands posed severe challenges, especially in low-lying regions or near river deltas. Medieval roads through swampy areas were difficult to maintain. The ground beneath travelers' feet could appear solid but sink unexpectedly under pressure. Wagons became stuck, wheels sinking into wet ground, sometimes up to the axle. Freeing a wagon from mud required time, physical strength, and sometimes the assistance of locals. Animals also struggled in swampy terrain. Stepping into deep mud strained joints and risked injury. Travelers often avoided swamps entirely, taking long detours around marshlands even when the detour added considerable distance. In some regions, communities constructed raised paths made of logs, stones, or brush. These makeshift trackways provided temporary stability but required continuous upkeep. Logs decayed, stones shifted, and brush disintegrated, meaning the path's condition varied dramatically across seasons. During wet months, even these constructed paths became slippery or submerged. Local inhabitants sometimes placed markers, bundles of sticks or stones, to indicate the safest route, but these were vulnerable to weather and theft. Travelers who lacked familiarity with swampy routes risked straying onto unstable ground, becoming trapped or losing time. Swamps also created navigation difficulties. Their appearance changed frequently as water levels rose or fell. Landmarks became unreliable. Fog often settled over marshlands, reducing visibility further. Without clear visual markers, travelers relied on sound and intuition, following the calls of distant birds or the direction of the wind as makeshift navigation aids. These methods worked only for those experienced in such environments. Outsiders often became disoriented. The quietness of marshes, combined with shifting terrain, made progress slow and stressful, requiring travelers to move deliberately and avoid unnecessary risks. Forests represented another major natural obstacle. Medieval Europe contained vast expanses of woodland, many of which remained largely untouched by human activity. Forest roads existed, but they were narrow, dark, and uneven. Fallen leaves covered holes, roots, and stones. Travelers often had to clear branches manually or maneuver around fallen trunks. Dense undergrowth hid hazards that could turn an otherwise simple journey into a challenging one. The canopy overhead blocked sunlight, making forest paths dim even during midday. Without clear visibility, travelers learned to trust the path beneath their feet, listening for subtle changes in terrain and watching for slight deviations that indicated the correct route. The uneven ground in forests also challenged travelers. Tree roots caused the path to rise and fall irregularly, creating tripping hazards and uneven surfaces for wagons. Rainfall made forest floors slippery, particularly where moss or decaying leaves accumulated. Travelers often preferred to skirt the edges of forests rather than travel directly through them, though this was not always possible. In dense forests, the path was sometimes barely distinguishable from the surrounding vegetation. Travelers learned to look for consistent signs, worn earth, repeated depressions, and broken vegetation to remain on the correct route. Forests also obscured sound and sight. Travelers could not see approaching people or animals until they were very close. The stillness of a forest magnified sudden noises, making travelers cautious and deliberate in their movement. The isolation also presented psychological challenges. While actual danger from other travelers or animals was much lower than often imagined, the sense of enclosure made people more alert and less certain of their surroundings. This constant vigilance slowed progress. Because of these difficulties, travelers approached forests with preparation. They checked their equipment, tightened loads, and ensured animals were calm. They traveled through forests primarily during daylight, allowing more time to manage obstacles. They sought out paths used frequently by merchants or messengers, recognizing that such paths, though still difficult, tended to be clearer and more predictable. At forest edges, travelers often rested, ensuring they entered with adequate light and energy. Once inside, they focused on maintaining a steady pace, making small adjustments to avoid obstacles while avoiding unnecessary detours into thicker vegetation. In mountain regions, forests combined with steep terrain to create additional challenges. Paths followed natural contours, but often hugged slopes or cliffs. Travelers needed to proceed carefully, measuring each step or wheel turn. In such regions, the difficulty of the road increased dramatically after rainfall when water loosened soil and caused surface erosion. Small rock falls were common, forcing travelers to pause and clear the path before continuing. Traveling with wagons in these areas required even greater caution. Merchants often dismounted to guide their animals manually, ensuring the wagon did not tilt dangerously. Even without dramatic hazards, the combination of rivers, swamps, and forests created a landscape that required travelers to remain constantly aware. Moving between different types of terrain meant adjusting approaches repeatedly, slowing pace in swampy areas, maintaining balance in forests, taking strategic pauses near rivers, and calculating risks carefully at every natural obstacle. Travelers developed deep familiarity with the environment, understanding its rhythms, seasonal changes, and subtle signals. Local knowledge played a crucial role in navigating these obstacles. Villagers knew which rivers flooded frequently, which swamps remained unstable year-round, and which forest paths were safest. Travelers often relied on their guidance, asking questions at inns, farms, or roadside shelters before entering unfamiliar terrain. Even brief conversations provided valuable insight, allowing travelers to prepare mentally and physically for the conditions ahead. Merchants, in particular, integrated this knowledge into their long-term travel routines. They remembered which rivers required early morning crossings before water levels rose, which swamps hardened slightly after colder nights, and which forests were easiest to navigate during certain seasons. They adjusted their inventory, pack weight, and travel pace based on expected terrain. Such preparation meant the difference between a smooth journey and one filled with delays or hazards. Over time, travelers developed a rhythm of movement that respected natural obstacles. They understood that rivers demanded caution, swamps required patience, and forests needed steady focus. Rather than forcing their way through the landscape, they adapted to it, observing, adjusting, and making decisions based on accumulated experience. These skills were not optional. They were essential for survival and successful travel in the Middle Ages. In this way, rivers, swamps, and forests shaped more than individual journeys. They influenced trade routes, settlement development, and regional interaction. Towns often grew near reliable river crossings, on solid ground away from swampy regions, or at forest edges where travel became easier. Over generations, these natural obstacles helped determine patterns of communication and commerce, influencing the social and economic structure of medieval society. For medieval travelers, mountain regions presented some of the most demanding and unavoidable challenges on the road. Unlike forests or marshlands, which could sometimes be circumvented with reasonable detours, mountains demanded that travelers confront them directly. The steep terrain, shifting weather conditions, narrow passes, and limited visibility made mountain routes taxing even for experienced individuals. Travelers who attempted to cross these regions needed endurance, careful judgment, and a practical understanding of geography. Despite the risks, mountain passes often served as essential links between regions, connecting valleys, trade centers, and political territories. To understand medieval travel fully, one must examine why mountain routes were so difficult and how travelers adapted to these challenges. Mountain roads in the Middle Ages were not engineered pathways carved with precision. Instead, they evolved from trails used by shepherds, hunters, and local communities. These trails followed natural contours rather than ideal routes. They wound around enormous boulders, disappeared into rocky slopes, or descended sharply into ravines. The width of mountain paths varied considerably. Some stretches allowed carts to pass with care, while others were so narrow that only single-file movement was possible. This lack of uniformity made travel slow and unpredictable. Wagons required attentive handling, and animals needed careful guidance to avoid missteps. The steepness of mountain slopes represented a constant physical challenge. Ascending required sustained effort from both travelers and pack animals. Horses and mules strained against their loads, and merchants often dismounted to ease the burden, guiding animals by hand. On difficult slopes, animals risked losing footing, particularly on loose gravel or unstable soil. A stumble could lead to injury or delay, which was problematic in regions where lodging was limited. Descending slopes posed different risks. Wagons needed to be held back to prevent excessive speed. Travelers sometimes used ropes or wooden blocks to control the descent, anchoring wheels to slow the wagon's movement. Without such precautions, wagons could slide uncontrollably, endangering both goods and animals. Weather played a decisive role in mountain travel. Conditions could change rapidly and unpredictably. Clear skies in the morning did not guarantee safe conditions by afternoon. Clouds gathered quickly around peaks, bringing rain, snow, or strong winds with little warning. Rain made rocky paths slippery. Snow obscured the trail entirely. Fog reduced visibility so drastically that travelers could not see more than a few steps ahead. In such conditions, travelers often paused their journey, seeking temporary shelter beneath outcroppings or in designated resting points maintained by local communities. However, these shelters were sparse, and not every route provided safe resting areas. When weather deteriorated unexpectedly, travelers found themselves exposed on open slopes or narrow paths, forced to proceed with extreme caution. Narrow passes amplified these risks. In many mountain regions, the terrain funneled travelers into tight corridors between rock faces. These passes were often only wide enough for a single wagon or a small group of travelers walking close together. When two groups met from opposite directions, they had to negotiate carefully which side would yield. This negotiation sometimes required backing up long distances or finding small widened areas where a wagon could pull aside. In wet conditions, the difficulty multiplied. Muddy or icy surfaces made maneuvering precarious. Even a slight miscalculation could cause a wagon to slide or tip, especially if the path sloped toward a drop-off. Cliffside paths represented some of the most feared medieval routes. These roads ran along steep drops, where the terrain left little margin for error. Travelers moved slowly, maintaining focus on each step or wheel turn. Animals sensed the danger and often behaved nervously, requiring firm but calm handling. Merchants who traveled these routes regularly knew that speed offered no advantage. A steady pace and deliberate movements ensured safety far better than haste. When weather threatened, travelers avoided cliffside paths altogether, waiting in nearby villages or shelters until conditions improved. Rockfalls posed another significant threat in mountainous regions. Steep slopes, loose stones, and erosion made certain sections particularly vulnerable. Heavy rains loosened soil, causing small landslides that scattered rocks across the path. Travelers often encountered sections where debris had accumulated overnight. Clearing these obstacles required time and effort. Even small stones could damage wheels or injure animals if stepped on unexpectedly. In some areas, communities or seasonal workers periodically cleared major rockfalls, but many stretches remained unmanaged. Travelers could not assume that a familiar path would remain unchanged between journeys. Mountain streams created additional hazards. Meltwater flowed rapidly down slopes in the spring, cutting across paths and creating unexpected obstacles. These streams eroded soil from beneath the trail, creating weakened sections that collapsed under weight. Travelers had to test the ground repeatedly, especially after heavy rain or thawing. In summer, streams could dry up entirely, leaving behind uneven beds of smooth stones that made footing uncertain. Merchants learned to observe the landscape for signs of water flow, adjusting their pace or choosing alternative tracks in response. High altitudes also affected travelers and animals. Air grew thinner, decreasing stamina. Travelers accustomed to lowland routes felt the strain quickly. Rest stops became essential during steep climbs. Animals needed frequent breaks and careful monitoring. Merchants paid attention to breathing patterns and signs of fatigue, understanding that overexertion in mountainous regions risked long-term harm. Such considerations slowed travel but were necessary for safe passage. In some mountain areas, communities built rudimentary support structures for travelers. These included shelters, simple stone walls marking the safest sections, or carved footholds along narrow stretches. Hospitality networks existed in certain regions, often connected to monasteries or seasonal shepherd settlements. These shelters provided refuge during sudden weather changes, though they offered minimal comfort. Their primary function was protection from the elements. Travelers who planned carefully timed their journeys to reach these shelters before dusk or before predicted storms. However, their availability varied greatly across regions, and many mountain routes provided no such protection at all. Navigating mountain terrain required a different skill set than traveling through plains or forests. Travelers learned to read the land, the angle of slopes, the texture of soil, the presence of certain plant species that indicated firm or unstable ground. They observed how wind moved through passes, how clouds formed around peaks, and how sounds traveled differently in open mountain valleys. These observations helped them predict changes in terrain and weather. Travelers who lacked such familiarity faced greater risks, making local guides extremely valuable in difficult regions. Some merchants hired guides for specific mountain crossings, especially during seasons when weather and visibility fluctuated rapidly. Merchants also adapted their equipment and packing strategies when preparing for mountain routes. They secured loads more tightly, using additional straps or ropes to prevent shifting on steep inclines. Heavier items were packed low to stabilize wagons. Fragile goods were wrapped carefully, protected from jostling on uneven terrain. Spare parts, such as wheel wedges, wooden planks, or replacement pins, were carried for on-the-spot repairs. Before entering a mountain pass, merchants frequently conducted a thorough inspection of their wagon, tightening joints and ensuring wheels spun evenly. Any minor issue left unaddressed could escalate into a serious problem in remote mountain sections far from craftsmen or inns. Traffic patterns in mountain regions followed predictable rhythms. Travelers preferred early mornings, when temperatures were lower and winds calmer. Afternoon winds posed risks, especially in exposed passes where sudden gusts could unbalance wagons or unsettle animals. Travelers avoided ascending or descending steep slopes late in the day, knowing that fading light reduced visibility and increased danger. These patterns created a kind of informal synchronization among travelers who often encountered each other at similar points along the route. Cultural practices surrounding mountain routes varied by region. In some areas, local communities maintained traditions of assisting travelers, particularly during harsh seasons. Shepherds or woodcutters posted signals indicating dangerous conditions or temporary closures. Inns near mountain bases often provided detailed guidance based on recent traveler reports. These localized support networks improved safety modestly, but did not eliminate the inherent risks. Travelers respected these traditions, recognizing that local knowledge outweighed any assumptions formed during previous journeys. Despite the obvious dangers, mountain passes remained essential because they connected regions that relied on one another economically and socially. Trade networks spanned valleys, and merchants needed access to markets located on opposite sides of mountain ranges. Certain goods, wool, metal tools, salt, or woven cloth, traveled regularly through these passes. Even with steep paths and unpredictable conditions, the benefits of trade compelled merchants to cross mountains repeatedly. Over time, their familiarity with the landscape allowed them to navigate dangerous sections with confidence, though never without caution. Mountain routes also influenced the development of towns and settlements. Villages often grew near the entrance to major passes, offering lodging, supplies, and animal services to travelers preparing for the ascent or descent. These settlements depended economically on the steady movement of travelers. They maintained resting points, provided food and shelter, and facilitated repairs. Seasonal markets emerged in some areas, timed strategically to attract merchants traveling between regions. Over generations, these settlements became integral components of long-distance trade, supporting commerce by providing essential services. The challenges of mountainous terrain also shaped long-distance communication networks. Messengers carrying letters or official documents found mountain passes both unavoidable and difficult. Governments, when they existed in a more centralized form, recognized the necessity of these passes for maintaining control over distant regions. As such, certain passes received periodic maintenance funded by local authorities or regional rulers. Even then, the maintenance was limited compared to modern expectations. Repair teams cleared rock falls, reinforced weak sections, or rebuilt small bridges, but they lacked the tools and engineering knowledge to transform the routes into consistently safe roads. In many regions, mountain passes were seasonal routes. Travelers avoided them during winter and early spring when snow and ice made them impassable. Communities posted warnings or blocked access to certain passes to prevent travelers from attempting dangerous crossings. Merchants planned their annual routes accordingly, scheduling mountain crossings in late spring, summer, or early autumn when conditions were most stable. These seasonal rhythms shaped the flow of goods, influencing when certain products reached specific markets. For example, goods transported from one side of a mountain range often arrived during predictable times, allowing communities to plan accordingly. Despite the inherent dangers, travelers learned to manage mountain routes through experience, caution, and preparation. Their ability to adjust to the landscape, respecting its limits, reading its signs, and understanding its rhythms, allowed medieval trade and communication to function across vast and varied terrain. While modern infrastructure has transformed mountain travel, the medieval experience highlights how deeply geography influenced daily life, commerce, and movement. Mountains, cliffs, and narrow passes did not merely slow travelers down. They shaped regional interactions, influenced settlement patterns, and created distinct cultural and economic zones. The difficulty of crossing mountains reinforced the uniqueness of communities on either side, even as trade slowly connected them. These challenges remind us that medieval travel was not defined by speed or efficiency, but by resilience, adaptation, and practical knowledge developed over generations. When people imagine the dangers of medieval roads, they often picture dramatic events, ambushes, storms, or treacherous cliffs. Yet for most travelers, the real risks were far quieter, far more ordinary, and far more frequent. Medieval travel was shaped by the constant presence of smaller, everyday hazards that rarely made it into chronicles yet defined the experience of moving through a pre-modern landscape. These dangers were not extraordinary but routine, arising from interactions with animals, the limitations of equipment, and the realities of traveling through uneven and unpredictable terrain. Understanding these hazards provides a fuller view of why medieval journeys required patience, preparation, and continual alertness. One of the most common dangers travelers faced involved animals, both domestic and wild. Although medieval Europe had its share of predators, hostile encounters with them were far less frequent than stories sometimes suggest. More often, the danger came from the behavior of domesticated animals essential to travel itself. Horses, mules, oxen, and donkeys powered much of medieval transport, but they were sensitive to terrain, weather, and unexpected noises. Even well-trained animals stumbled on uneven ground, slipped on wet stones, or hesitated at river crossings. A single misstep by a pack animal could delay an entire journey. Injuries to hooves, legs, or backs were common and required immediate attention. Travelers carried basic tools for treatment: cloth for wrapping wounds, simple ointments, and spare horseshoes. But severe injuries forced them to stop for days or seek help in nearby villages. Animal behavior became particularly unpredictable in unfamiliar environments. When entering dense forests, animals reacted to scents or sounds hidden from travelers. A distant crack of a branch could cause horses to shy suddenly. In swampy regions, the unstable ground made animals nervous, and they moved cautiously, slowing the pace of travel. Mountain paths posed a different challenge. Animals sensed danger instinctively and required steady guidance to maintain balance on narrow routes. Even in low-risk areas, insects irritated animals, especially during summer. Flies and biting gnats caused animals to toss their heads, step sideways, or lose focus, increasing the likelihood of small accidents. Wild animals did pose occasional risks. Wolves, while generally avoiding humans, sometimes approached roads during harsh winters when food was scarce. They rarely attacked people but could startle horses or circle livestock being transported. Boars presented a more immediate danger. Known for their unpredictable behavior, they could charge suddenly when frightened, forcing travelers to move out of their path quickly. Deer jumping across roads, particularly during dusk or dawn, startled animals pulling wagons. Even harmless animals, such as hares or foxes, caused trouble by darting suddenly across the road, provoking unexpected reactions from horses. Accidents involving wagons were another frequent hazard. Medieval wagons were simple constructions, wooden frames, iron fittings, and wheels that relied on natural materials, which weakened over time. The constant jostling of rough roads loosened joints, wore down axles, and cracked wooden spokes. Travelers checked their wagons regularly, tightening bolts and replacing worn parts, but problems still occurred. A broken wheel on a steep slope or in a remote forest could halt travel entirely. Repairing such damage required tools, spare parts, and stable ground, which were not always available. Merchants planned for such contingencies by carrying replacement pins, wedges, and ropes, but even these preparations had limits. When a major structural failure occurred, Travelers sometimes had to abandon their wagons temporarily or seek assistance from nearby villagers who possessed specialized tools. Wagon overturning represented one of the more serious risks. On uneven ground, especially in mountainous or forested areas, a wagon could tilt dangerously. Heavy loads contributed to instability. Travelers tried to load goods evenly, distributing weight carefully between left and right sides. Yet, even with careful packing, shifting loads caused by bumps or sudden stops disrupted the balance. If a wagon tipped over, goods could be damaged, animals could be injured, and travelers lost valuable time recovering. Such incidents also strained resources, as repairing damage or repacking goods often required an entire day. Another hazard came from simple slips and falls. Traveling long distances on foot or alongside wagons exhausted even experienced travelers. Fatigue reduced concentration, making small missteps more likely. Loose stones, uneven paths, exposed roots, or hidden holes caused twisted ankles, bruises, or cuts. Travelers accepted these injuries as part of road life, but repeated strain accumulated. A bad fall could prevent a traveler from continuing alone, requiring assistance from others or forcing them to remain in a nearby settlement until recovered. Merchants accustomed to long journeys developed strategies to reduce fatigue, pacing themselves, taking regular breaks, and maintaining appropriate footwear, but tiredness still remained unavoidable during long stretches of uneven terrain. Weather magnified everyday hazards. Rain turned slopes into slippery surfaces, ice-coated roads in winter, making even standard paths treacherous. Snow obscured uneven ground. Strong winds pushed travelers off balance or destabilized wagon covers. Even dry weather created risks. Dust reduced visibility and made it easier to miss small hazards underfoot. Travelers adjusted their pace based on conditions, understanding that rushing increased the likelihood of accidents. Crossing makeshift bridges or wooden planks created additional challenges. Many small bridges lacked railings and were only as wide as necessary for a wagon or pack animals. Boards warped over time, nails loosened, and supports weakened. When crossing, travelers often walked beside their wagons, guiding animals carefully. Even then, boards creaked uneasily under weight. In some cases, planks broke without warning. When bridges collapsed partially, travelers scrambled to rescue goods before they fell into water below. Rebuilding or reinforcing these structures required community effort, meaning travelers passing through had no control over their condition. Another common hazard came from roadside ditches, used in some regions to direct rainwater away from paths. While these ditches helped maintain roads during heavy rain, they created risks when visibility was low or when wagons veered slightly off track. Wagons that slid into ditches required significant effort to extract. Pack animals that stepped into ditches risked leg injuries. Even experienced travelers underestimated the depth or width of these trenches in poor light. At night or during fog, the risk increased dramatically, prompting travelers to avoid movement during such conditions whenever possible. Trees near roads also contributed to hazards. Branches weakened by storms fell unpredictably. Dead trees, especially in older forests, collapsed without warning. Travelers often heard cracking sounds moments before a fall, but rarely had time to react. Such occurrences became more frequent in storms or after heavy snowfall, when accumulated weight stressed branches. Travelers avoided resting under old trees or those leaning at suspicious angles, choosing cleared areas whenever possible. Livestock moving along roads introduced another layer of complexity. Farmers frequently herded sheep, cattle, or goats along routes connecting fields and grazing areas. These herds slowed travelers, forced detours, or created chaotic moments when animals scattered unexpectedly. While such interactions were usually minor inconveniences, they occasionally caused accidents if a startled animal darted into a wagon's path or brushed against a pack animal, disrupting its balance. Travelers learned to approach herds slowly and give ample space to herders managing movement. In some regions, carts and wagons traveling in opposite directions created bottlenecks on narrow roads. Maneuvering required communication and caution. One party needed to yield, finding a wider area or pulling off the path. Miscommunication sometimes led to minor collisions or delays. Travelers with fragile goods preferred waiting rather than risking damage from hurried exchanges. These interactions reflected the practical negotiation required on roads not designed for two-way traffic. Human error contributed significantly to everyday hazards. Poorly balanced loads, inadequate equipment checks, or misjudged distances led to issues that could otherwise be avoided. Travelers who rushed preparations or neglected routine inspections paid the price on the road. Inexperienced travelers often overloaded animals, underestimating the strain placed on them during long journeys. This resulted in premature exhaustion or injury, slowing progress and increasing the likelihood of accidents. Over time, seasoned travelers developed systematic routines, checking hoof condition, testing wheel stability, securing straps, and inspecting path conditions ahead. Rest stops also involved subtle dangers. Sleeping outdoors or at makeshift shelters exposed travelers to cold ground, damp conditions, and nighttime disturbances. Animals tethered nearby might wander, break loose, or react to nocturnal movement. Fires used for warmth or cooking needed careful management to prevent accidental spread, especially in dry seasons. Travelers maintained discipline even during rest, ensuring that fatigue did not lead to carelessness. Interactions with other travelers, though generally peaceful, sometimes created minor hazards. Groups moving at different speeds needed coordination to avoid collisions on narrow paths. Travelers carrying long tools or poles inadvertently blocked space or struck others while maneuvering. Crowded road sections near markets or town entrances required heightened alertness to avoid entanglements. Even friendly conversations could distract travelers at critical moments, especially when navigating uneven ground or negotiating tricky terrain. In agricultural regions, travelers encountered tools, equipment, or debris left near fields or along paths. Plows, wooden frames, or discarded branches obstructed movement. Farmers working close to the road sometimes inadvertently blocked sections with carts or piles of harvested crops. Travelers navigated these obstacles with patience, understanding that rural life was intertwined with the roads themselves. Finally, the combination of all these everyday hazards created a cumulative effect that shaped the entire experience of medieval travel. Travelers remained alert not because of constant dramatic danger, but because small, manageable risks appeared continuously. The absence of major events did not reduce the need for careful judgment. In fact, it heightened it. Steady movement required addressing minor issues before they became serious problems. A loose strap secured early prevented lost goods later. A cautious approach to a muddy slope prevented a twisted ankle. A brief pause to observe an animal's behavior prevented a fall or stumble. In this way, the medieval road system demanded practical intelligence from every traveler. Knowledge of local conditions, experience with animals, familiarity with equipment, and patience in the face of obstacles formed the essential skill set needed for safe travel. These skills were learned not through formal training, but through repeated journeys, shared stories, and careful observation. While dramatic events sometimes occurred, it was the quiet, consistent presence of everyday hazards that most shaped medieval travel. Travelers who understood this reality, preparing thoroughly, moving steadily, and respecting the road's limitations, were the ones who reached their destinations with minimal difficulty. Their success lay not in strength or speed, but in steady caution and practical awareness, qualities that defined the medieval approach to the dangerous roads woven across the landscape. Among all the hazards that medieval travelers faced, one of the most common and quietly stressful was the simple act of losing the road. Unlike natural disasters or sudden dangers, getting lost rarely happened all at once. It began gradually, often unnoticed, until travelers realized that familiar signs had disappeared and the landscape no longer matched what they expected. Without standardized maps, clear signage, or reliable communication, even experienced travelers faced moments of uncertainty. Navigating the medieval world required not only physical endurance, but a strong sense of direction, attention to detail, and the ability to judge subtle changes in terrain. Understanding how easily travelers went off course reveals the complexity of medieval travel and the importance of local knowledge in an age before modern navigation. Medieval roads did not look like modern roads. There were no painted lines, directional arrows, or milestones indicating distance. A road could be a lightly worn path between fields, a cluster of parallel ruts where travelers shifted to avoid mud, or a faint trail in forests that blended with the ground around it. Roads changed with seasons. A path visible in summer might be obscured by fallen leaves in autumn or covered by snow in winter. In rainy months, travelers bypassed muddy sections, inadvertently creating new tracks that confused future travelers who did not know which path represented the original road. These constant changes meant that travelers relied heavily on memory, experience, or local guidance. Those unfamiliar with the region were particularly vulnerable to misjudging direction. Junctions were especially confusing. Where 2 or 3 paths intersected, the correct route was not always obvious. Some roads diverged around obstacles and rejoined later, while others split permanently. Travelers needed to interpret the shape of the landscape, slight depressions indicating a frequently used track, subtle changes in vegetation, or the presence of distant structures such as farmhouses or fences. Without a clear sense of direction, even a slight deviation at a junction could send travelers in the wrong direction for hours. Merchants on long routes often paused at junctions to study the terrain, inspect wheel ruts, or search for signs of frequent passage such as flattened grass or discarded debris. Villages and small settlements served as important navigational points. Travelers entering a village often asked for directions before continuing. However, relying on verbal guidance had its limitations. Local residents provided instructions based on their perspective, assuming travelers understood landmarks that were familiar only to locals. Directions frequently included references to fields, trees, or farm boundaries that outsiders had never seen before. Instructions like "follow the road until the large oak, then turn where the land slopes toward the stream" worked well for villagers but confused travelers unfamiliar with the area. Misinterpretation of such instructions sent many travelers off course, even when they believed they were following directions precisely. Language differences complicated navigation further. Medieval Europe was linguistically diverse. Dialects varied significantly even between neighboring regions. Travelers who spoke different dialects or languages sometimes misunderstood instructions entirely. Simple terms such as left, right, near, or far could be interpreted differently or confused with similar-sounding words. Merchants who frequently traveled long distances learned to recognize different dialects and interpret local ways of describing distance or direction, but inexperienced travelers struggled. Miscommunication led to detours, backtracking, or entering regions they had not intended to visit. Environmental changes also contributed to travelers losing their way. Flooded rivers forced travelers to take alternative routes, bypassing familiar sections of the road. In mountainous regions, rock falls or landslides blocked paths, compelling travelers to find temporary detours that lacked clear direction. Forests shifted subtly over seasons as undergrowth thickened or thinned. A path visible in early spring might be difficult to follow by midsummer. In marshland regions, rising water obscured paths entirely, leaving travelers to rely on improvised walkways or guidance from locals. Such environmental changes made it easy to stray from the intended route without realizing it. Travelers who became lost often recognized the problem gradually. They noticed that the ground felt less packed, suggesting fewer travelers used the path. Vegetation grew thicker. Familiar wheel ruts disappeared. Sounds changed. Instead of distant voices or animal noise from nearby settlements, travelers heard only wind or unfamiliar bird calls. The road might narrow suddenly or divide repeatedly without clear indication of the correct branch. These subtle signals alerted travelers that they might have strayed, prompting them to pause and reassess their direction. When confusion arose, travelers used a variety of strategies to regain orientation. Some climbed small hills or ridges to view the surrounding landscape. From a vantage point, they looked for distant towns, church spires, or identifiable geographical features such as rivers or ridges. These elevated views often helped travelers relocate their position within the region. Merchants traveling familiar routes compared the landscape with mental maps built over years of experience. They noted the shape of valleys, the direction of slopes, or the placement of settlements relative to major landmarks. Such knowledge reduced the risk of becoming lost, but did not eliminate it entirely. Travelers also relied on common sense, an essential navigational tool in the medieval world. If a road narrowed excessively or became overgrown, it suggested low usage and therefore low likelihood of leading to major towns. Conversely, a wider, clearer road indicated frequent traffic and therefore greater reliability. The direction of water flow helped travelers determine where rivers or settlements might be. Even the behavior of animals provided clues. Domesticated animals wandering near the road indicated proximity to human habitation. Observing these signs allowed travelers to correct their course gradually. Despite careful observation, serious misdirection occurred regularly. In dense forests, travelers sometimes walked in circles without realizing it. Landmarks looked similar from different angles. Paths overlapped or diverged confusingly. Travelers who lacked strong orientation skills found themselves deeper in the forest than expected. In such cases, locating sunlight through the canopy provided partial guidance, but forest density often limited the effectiveness of this method. Swampy regions created similar problems. Travelers avoiding unstable ground unknowingly drifted far from established routes. Because the terrain lacked distinctive visual features, travelers found it difficult to determine how far they had deviated. Marshes also distorted sound, making it harder to hear distant settlement noises that might otherwise guide navigation. Once off course, travelers in these regions struggled to find solid ground from which to reassess their direction. Mountains presented the most dangerous form of misdirection. Travelers who took the wrong path at a fork often ended up on steep slopes or dead-end trails leading to isolated ledges. Backtracking in mountainous terrain required careful maneuvering, especially with wagons or heavily loaded animals. Fog further increased the risk of misdirection by obscuring both the path and surrounding landscape. Travelers caught in fog sometimes stopped entirely, waiting for visibility to return rather than risk stepping into unknown terrain. Even flat agricultural regions created opportunities for misdirection. Fields expanded or shifted annually depending on crop rotations. Farmers sometimes plowed over old paths or created new access routes that resembled established roads. Travelers walking beside fields occasionally followed paths meant only for farm use, discovering too late that these routes did not connect to major roads. During harvest seasons, piles of crops or agricultural equipment temporarily blocked sections of road, forcing travelers to make detours that proved confusing. Getting lost carried practical consequences. For merchants transporting goods on tight schedules, delays reduced the value of items sensitive to freshness or seasonality. Perishable goods such as cheese, butter, or certain fruits required timely delivery. Even durable goods such as wool or tools lost potential profit when delays prevented merchants from reaching markets on time. Travelers also risked exhausting supplies. Water sources were not guaranteed, and food supplies carried for long journeys needed careful rationing. Becoming lost increased consumption of these supplies as travelers spent extra days on the road. When lost, travelers often sought help from locals. Approaching isolated farmhouses or small hamlets, they asked for guidance or temporary shelter. Residents familiar with the area provided directions, warnings about dangerous routes, or information about recent road changes. Some communities maintained resting points near confusing junctions or major landmarks. These sites offered travelers an opportunity to gather information, reorient themselves, and prepare for the next segment of their journey. However, such points were not always available in remote or sparsely populated regions. In situations where no help was available, travelers relied heavily on group dynamics. Groups traveling together consulted collectively, combining their observations to make decisions. Experienced members offered insight based on past journeys. Groups also provided emotional reassurance, reducing panic or frustration when the road became confusing. Solo travelers lacked these advantages, making misdirection more stressful and potentially more dangerous. Returning to the correct route sometimes required covering significant extra distance. A traveler who followed the wrong fork in a road might walk several miles before recognizing the mistake. Turning back consumed valuable time and energy. In some cases, travelers discovered alternative routes that eventually rejoined the main road, though these paths were often less direct and more difficult. Others encountered natural barriers, such as rivers or steep slopes, that forced them to retrace their steps fully. Despite the inconvenience, becoming lost was considered a normal part of travel. Medieval people did not expect perfect routes or flawless navigation. They accepted that roads were variable, landscapes changed, and local guidance was imperfect. This acceptance shaped their mental approach to travel. Journeys were flexible rather than rigidly timed, and delays were common enough that travelers incorporated them into their expectations. Ultimately, the experience of getting lost on medieval roads highlights the importance of practical knowledge, careful observation, and adaptability in pre-modern travel. While we often imagine medieval people navigating with certainty, the reality was far more complex. Their journeys required ongoing negotiation with the landscape, the weather, and the limits of their information. Getting lost was not a failure, but a recurring aspect of movement through a world shaped by natural features rather than human design. Travelers who reached their destinations did so not because they followed perfect paths, but because they learned to manage uncertainty, to move slowly when the road seemed unclear, to observe the ground carefully, to ask questions when possible, and to correct mistakes steadily. In this way, misdirection and its correction formed a central part of medieval travel, shaping both the pace and the character of journeys across the varied and often unpredictable roads of the Middle Ages. For medieval travelers, the timing of a journey was just as important as the route itself. Roads changed dramatically with the seasons, and the challenges of travel varied throughout the year. Unlike modern travelers, who rely on weather forecasts, engineered infrastructure, and year-round transportation systems, medieval people planned their movements around predictable seasonal patterns. Missing the ideal travel window could turn even a simple journey into a difficult or risky undertaking. Seasonal awareness was not a luxury, but a necessity, a foundational part of travel culture in the Middle Ages. Understanding how seasons shaped movement helps explain why medieval journeys often unfolded slowly and carefully, with long pauses dictated by nature rather than personal schedules. Spring marked the beginning of widespread travel after the long lull of winter, but it was also one of the most unpredictable seasons. Snowmelt transformed roads into muddy channels, with water pooling in depressions and flooding low-lying paths. The freeze-thaw cycle destabilized soil, causing minor landslides in hilly regions and loosening stones on mountain paths. River crossings became particularly risky during this time. Meltwater raised water levels, and currents were stronger and more variable. Fords safe in late summer became treacherous in early spring. Travelers understood these conditions well. Merchants often delayed long-distance travel until mid or late spring, giving roads time to dry and rivers time to stabilize. Still, certain trades required early movement. Wool merchants preparing for seasonal markets or messengers carrying urgent letters. These travelers moved cautiously, testing the ground frequently and seeking the most reliable crossings. The unpredictable weather of spring created additional challenges. Sudden rainfall turned firm soil soft within hours. Fog hung over fields and valley roads, reducing visibility and making it difficult to follow faint paths. For travelers unfamiliar with the region, spring increased the likelihood of getting lost. Grass and new growth obscured older tracks, and seasonal flooding forced detours that might or might not lead back to main routes. People traveling in spring kept supplies ready for delays, knowing that progress often slowed unexpectedly. Despite these hazards, spring offered important advantages. Warmer temperatures reduced the risk of snowstorms. Vegetation and wildlife signaled direction and distance more clearly than in winter. Inns and roadside shelters reopened for the busy season, preparing for increased traffic. Communities conducted basic repairs on roads, removing large debris, clearing blocked paths, and reinforcing small bridges weakened by winter. These efforts did not transform medieval roads into reliable passages, but they improved conditions enough to support early season travel. By summer, medieval roads reached their most predictable and stable condition: dry, weather-hardened soil, reducing the risk of mud and making most paths passable. River levels dropped, making fords easier to cross. Long daylight hours allowed travelers to cover more distance in a single day, and visibility improved dramatically. For these reasons, summer became the preferred season for long-distance trade. Annual fairs in many regions took place in summer, attracting merchants from far and wide. Movement increased across all major routes, creating a steady flow of goods, people, and information. However, even summer carried its share of challenges. heat affected both travelers and animals. Horses and mules fatigued more quickly, especially when carrying heavy loads. Travelers moved earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon to avoid the hottest hours. Dust became a significant nuisance. Dry soil crumbled easily under footsteps and wagon wheels, creating clouds of fine particles that irritated eyes, clogged nostrils, and settled on goods. Water became a critical resource. Travelers planned their routes around known wells, streams, or inns, ensuring they had access to drinking water throughout the day. Vegetation posed another challenge during summer. Roads not used frequently became overgrown with tall grasses or shrubs, obscuring irregularities in the ground and making paths less visible. Travelers sometimes carried simple tools to clear narrow stretches when needed. In forested areas, undergrowth became thick and tangled, slowing movement. Fire risk increased during prolonged dry periods. Wildfires, though not common everywhere, occasionally forced travelers to turn back or take long detours around affected areas. Despite these obstacles, summer remained the safest and most efficient season for medieval travel. The predictability of dry weather allowed merchants to plan journeys with greater confidence. Seasonal workers moved between regions to seek employment. Pilgrims traveled to religious sites. Messengers carrying government instructions or merchant correspondence moved swiftly along familiar routes. Communities prepared for this increased movement by maintaining roadside services, stocking inns, and preparing supplies for passing travelers. Autumn introduced a new cycle of challenges. At the beginning of the season, early autumn often resembled late summer. Roads remained mostly dry, vegetation thinned, and temperatures cooled slightly, making travel comfortable. But as autumn progressed, conditions changed quickly. Rainfall increased, softening roads and creating muddy stretches similar to those of early spring. Farmers harvested crops and transported goods along the same roads used by travelers, creating congestion or blocking sections with equipment. Travelers needed to navigate around agricultural activity, slowing their pace or waiting for workers to clear the way. Harvest debris sometimes covered paths, making them difficult to distinguish from surrounding fields. In some regions, farmers plowed close to road edges or across older paths, forcing travelers to adjust their routes. The combination of agricultural traffic and unpredictable weather made mid to late autumn a challenging season for travel. River levels rose with increased rainfall, turning shallow crossings into uncertain ones. Wooden bridges weakened by summer heat sometimes warped or cracked with the return of moisture, creating new structural dangers. Autumn days grew shorter, limiting daylight for navigation. Travelers who did not reach inns or settlements by nightfall risked navigating in poor light, a difficult prospect on roads lacking clear boundaries. Fog became more frequent, particularly near rivers and lowlands, further complicating visibility. These cumulative factors made autumn a season of transition, manageable at first but increasingly unpredictable as winter approached. Winter introduced the harshest travel conditions. In colder regions, snow covered the ground for extended periods, making paths nearly invisible. Travelers had to rely on memory, local guides, or distant landmarks such as hill shapes or the direction of tree lines. Snow concealed holes, rocks, and uneven surfaces, increasing the risk of missteps or wagon accidents. Ice made descents dangerous and hills difficult to climb. Frozen rivers offered potential shortcuts but required careful judgment. Crossing too early in winter risked thin ice. Crossing too late risked thawing sections. Only travelers with substantial experience or urgent reasons braved such conditions. Cold temperatures posed additional risks. Travelers exhausted more energy just staying warm, and animals required greater care to prevent strain or illness. Supplies needed careful management, as food froze or became difficult to access. Resting outdoors became dangerous, prompting travelers to rely heavily on inns or community shelters. These facilities, however, were not always available or adequately prepared for winter travelers. Nights grew long and temperatures fell quickly after sunset, limiting the time available for safe movement. In milder regions with little or no snowfall, winter remained challenging due to heavy rains. Roads became muddy and waterlogged. Rivers flooded more frequently. Cold rain reduced visibility and dampened clothing, increasing discomfort and slowing progress. Even in regions spared from heavy snow, winter was rarely a favorable season for travel. Because of these difficulties, many medieval people avoided long journeys in winter entirely. Merchants planned routes carefully to ensure they reached their winter destinations before severe weather set in. Travelers who needed to move during winter often stayed close to established settlements, avoiding remote or mountainous regions. Winter sometimes halted long-distance communication, delaying correspondence or restricting the movement of goods. The seasonality of travel influenced medieval society in important ways. Trade patterns developed around predictable travel seasons. Markets and fairs occurred when roads were safest. Agricultural cycles shaped not only local economy, but road usage as well. Communities expected larger numbers of travelers in summer and early autumn and prepared accordingly. Inns stored more supplies, craftsmen anticipated equipment repairs, and ferrymen maintained their boats. Conversely, winter saw reduced movement and settlements adjusted to quieter roads. Communication also followed seasonal rhythms. Letters delivered by travelers or messengers moved more quickly during dry seasons. Governments, where they existed in more centralized forms, recognized these patterns and timed administrative demands accordingly. Seasonal conditions shaped the movement of ideas, news, and cultural practices, influencing interaction between regions. Travelers adapted to these realities with a combination of planning, observation, and practical judgment. They understood the road as a dynamic environment shaped by changing seasons. They carried different supplies depending on expected conditions: extra cloth in winter, waterskins in summer, walking sticks for slippery spring paths. They adjusted their routes and schedules around seasonal challenges. Experience taught them that safe travel depended less on speed than on timing. Ultimately, seasonal travel in the Middle Ages reflects a world in which people respected nature's rhythms. Movement depended on understanding weather, terrain, and timing. The roads were not passive routes, but shifting landscapes requiring careful negotiation. Travelers who recognized these patterns reached their destinations with fewer setbacks, while those who ignored them risked significant delays or danger. The medieval approach to seasonal travel demonstrates how deeply connected people were to the natural world. Roads changed with the landscape, and travel adapted accordingly. By learning to move with the seasons rather than against them, medieval people developed a practical and enduring relationship with the environment that shaped every journey they made. For medieval travelers, time mattered almost as much as distance. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the nature of travel changed entirely. Roads that were already uneven, unmarked, and unpredictable became far more difficult to navigate in darkness. With no artificial lighting, no illuminated markers, and no reliable ways to gauge direction at night, travelers deeply respected the arrival of sunset. Moving after dark was rarely a first choice, usually a last resort driven by necessity, urgency, or miscalculation. Understanding why night travel was avoided helps illuminate the practical realities of medieval life and the limitations people accepted as normal in a world without modern illumination. Daylight was the primary guide for travelers. Roads were visible only when lit by the sun, and even then, their boundaries could be unclear. Travelers navigated by observing subtle features: the texture of the ground, the depth of wheel ruts, the direction of distant valleys, the placement of lone trees or structures, and changes in vegetation. All of these visual cues disappeared at night. Even on clear evenings, moonlight provided insufficient illumination to identify small hazards such as holes, roots, rocks, or sudden dips in the terrain. On cloudy nights, darkness enveloped everything to the point where travelers could not see their own feet clearly. The absence of visibility made movement slow and uncertain. Animals that aided transport also depended on light. Horses, mules, and oxen struggled to navigate uneven ground in darkness. Although animals possessed better low-light vision than humans, the irregular surfaces of medieval roads still posed significant risks. A single misstep could injure an animal's leg, halt the entire journey, or require expensive treatment from a local farrier. Animals reacted nervously to nighttime noises, rustling leaves, distant calls, or unfamiliar sounds carried by wind. This nervousness translated into hesitations, sudden stops, or attempts to turn around, complicating the traveler's efforts to maintain a steady pace. Merchants understood that pushing animals at night increased the likelihood of accidents. In many regions, roads passed through forests, marshes, hills, or riverside areas, each presenting unique hazards at night. Forests became especially dark, with dense canopies blocking moonlight. Paths blended with surrounding undergrowth, and travelers struggled to distinguish where the road ended and the forest floor began. Animals in forests often moved at night, not aggressively, but unpredictably. Deer crossed roads quietly, boars foraged for food, and smaller creatures scurried through the brush. These movements startled pack animals and complicated navigation. Tree roots, fallen branches, and uneven ground were nearly impossible to detect in darkness, increasing the risk of tripping or overturning a wagon. Roads near rivers were equally hazardous. Water appeared darker than the surrounding land, making the edges difficult to identify. Travelers risked stepping into unexpected shallows or soft mud. Nighttime humidity created slick surfaces on wooden bridges, which were already narrow and unguarded. Crossing a bridge without visibility required cautious, deliberate movement. Even experienced travelers hesitated to cross river paths after dark unless absolutely necessary. Marshy regions posed perhaps the greatest risk. Without light, it was nearly impossible to judge the stability of ground ahead. A safe path during the day became a guessing game at night. Wet areas, puddles, and soft ground absorbed sound differently, confusing travelers who relied on auditory cues. Missteps in marshes caused delays and injuries. Wagons sank into mud, animals became stuck, and travelers exhausted themselves trying to pull them free. Because these conditions worsened significantly at night, most travelers chose to avoid marshy roads entirely after sunset. Another factor that discouraged night travel was the absence of safe resting points. Inns and roadside shelters were spaced according to daytime distances. Travelers planned their routes around reaching these points before dark. Inns closed their doors after dusk, both for safety and practicality. Opening the doors at night risked admitting strangers when the innkeeper could not properly verify their intentions. Roadside shelters offered minimal protection, but their presence was inconsistent and limited primarily to popular trade routes or regions prone to storms. Travelers caught between inns after sunset faced sleeping outdoors, often in uncomfortable or exposed areas. Nighttime temperatures introduced additional risks. Even in warmer seasons, nighttime chill affected travelers, particularly those traveling long distances or carrying limited supplies. Cold air sapped energy and made rest difficult. In wet seasons, the combination of cold and dampness increased the risk of illness. Travelers accustomed to mild days found themselves unprepared for sharp drops in temperature. Animals also suffered from cold, especially those carrying heavy loads or being pushed beyond their normal endurance. Another major reason to avoid night travel was the increased likelihood of becoming lost. As discussed in previous chapters, even experienced travelers occasionally lost their way during the day. At night, the chances increased dramatically. Without visible landmarks, travelers found it difficult to determine direction. Paths that appeared clear at sunset dissolved into darkness by nightfall. Trails branching off into fields or forests looked identical. Even the silhouette of distant hills or settlements became indistinguishable. Travelers might unknowingly take a wrong turn, wander into farmland, or follow animal trails instead of human paths. Once disoriented, correcting direction at night became nearly impossible until daylight returned. The need for caution at night was not only practical but cultural. Medieval people developed a consistent rhythm of daily life governed by natural light. Work began at sunrise and ended at sunset. Travelers followed similar patterns. The concept of moving at night contradicted the established order of daily activities. Communities expected roads to fall quiet after sundown. People indoors lit candles or oil lamps only as needed, conserving resources and avoiding unnecessary danger, since open flames posed fire risks. These routines shaped the expectations of travelers, who planned their movements accordingly. Night travel also increased the difficulty of reading terrain for potential dangers unrelated to navigation. As discussed in earlier chapters, the medieval road environment included everyday hazards such as ditches, loose stones, uneven surfaces, tree roots, and narrow bridges. At night, these hazards became virtually invisible. Travelers moved slowly, testing the ground with their feet or staff before committing weight. This slow pace drastically reduced the distance that could be covered. A journey that took 2 hours in daylight might require 6 or more hours in darkness. Because medieval travelers depended on efficiency to reach inns, ferries, or resting points on time, moving at such a slow pace disrupted the entire journey plan. Another consideration was security, but not in the exaggerated sense often portrayed in fiction. While roadside theft existed, it was not constant or universal. Still, night travel increased vulnerability simply because visibility declined. Travelers could not easily see who or what approached them. People encountered on the road after sunset were treated with caution, not necessarily because they were dangerous, but because communication in darkness was harder. Misunderstandings occurred more easily when travelers could not read facial expressions or gestures. For this reason, even honest travelers tended to avoid moving around after dark. Communication challenges extended to interactions with locals. If travelers reached a settlement at night, they could not easily ask for directions or assistance. Knocking on doors after dark was discouraged socially and often viewed suspiciously. Households prioritized security and privacy at night, and unexpected visitors naturally caused concern. Travelers learned to plan ahead to avoid creating such situations. The technological limitations of the era also discouraged night travel. Torches provided limited illumination and were impractical for long-distance movement. They consumed fuel quickly, required constant maintenance to prevent extinguishing, and offered narrow beams of flickering light that illuminated only a few steps ahead. Lanterns provided somewhat better illumination, but were still too dim to reveal many hazards. Carrying lanterns for long distances placed additional strain on travelers and offered little advantage in challenging terrain. Because night travel was discouraged culturally and practically, travelers developed sophisticated strategies to avoid being caught on the road after sunset. Merchants estimated distances carefully, understanding how long it would take to reach the next waypoint. They adjusted their pace throughout the day to ensure arrival before dusk. They maintained awareness of the sun's position in the sky and paused less frequently as evening approached. Groups communicated regularly to assess whether they needed to increase their pace to arrive before dark. Inns played a central role in this timing. Travelers who arrived earlier in the day secured lodging more easily. As dusk approached, inns filled quickly, especially during busy seasons. Late travelers risked finding inns full, forcing them to move in darkness until they reached another resting point or to sleep outdoors near the roadside. Sleeping outside, though not unprecedented, was neither safe nor comfortable. Travelers slept lightly, kept animals close, and remained alert to sounds. Even without fear of dramatic dangers, cold weather, moisture, or animal movement interrupted rest frequently. For these reasons, avoiding nighttime travel became a hallmark of prudent planning. Ferries also shaped the timing of travel. Ferrymen did not operate after dark due to visibility issues and safety concerns. Travelers arriving at a river after sunset had no choice but to wait until morning. This delay affected schedules significantly, pushing back arrival at markets, meetings, or other planned destinations. The predictability of ferry hours encouraged travelers to plan routes and departure times carefully. Many merchants preferred to spend the night near riverbanks during daylight rather than risk reaching the crossing after it closed, even if they theoretically had time to continue. In mountainous regions, night travel posed exceptional dangers. Steep slopes, narrow ledges, and uneven surfaces made movement risky even during daylight. After sunset, these hazards multiplied dramatically. Travelers could not see the edge of a path or judge the stability of the ground. Wind intensified unpredictably in mountain passes as temperatures dropped. Animals hesitated, sensing the difficulty of navigating slopes without visual input. Travelers who attempted mountain paths at night risked being stranded on narrow ledges or encountering blocked sections with no room to maneuver. Even in open plains, where terrain was more forgiving, night travel remained undesirable. Without natural features to guide direction, travelers misjudged distance and wandered off course. The lack of sounds in open plains created an unsettling silence. Animal calls traveled unexpectedly long distances, distorting perception of proximity. In the absence of visible landmarks, travelers relied on stars for direction, But this required clear skies and knowledge of constellations, skills not universal among travelers. Despite these challenges, night travel did occur when absolutely necessary. Urgent messages, political demands, or emergencies compelled some travelers to move in darkness. Experienced messengers possessed better navigation skills and carried knowledge of safe nighttime routes. They knew where risks were lower, broad roads near towns, paths along open ridges, or routes with consistent landmarks. These individuals were exceptions, not the rule. Their ability to travel at night reflected specialized skills developed through repetition, not common practice among general travelers. In rare cases, travelers found themselves forced to continue after dark due to miscalculation or unexpected delays. A broken wheel, a delayed river crossing, or a slow-moving animal might push a traveler behind schedule. Recognizing the risks, travelers moved slowly and conservatively, often stopping at the first available safe spot to wait for morning light. They built small fires if conditions allowed, remaining alert until sunrise restored visibility. In the end, medieval avoidance of night travel reveals how deeply people relied on daylight and how limited human navigation was without artificial lighting. Roads shaped by natural conditions became far more challenging when deprived of visibility. Night magnified every ordinary hazard: uneven ground, mud, narrow paths, and river crossings, turning them into significant obstacles. Travelers viewed night as a boundary, a reminder that movement depended on nature's rhythms more than personal ambition. The medieval road system operated on a schedule defined by the sun. Those who traveled respected this rhythm, planning their movements with intention and caution. Night travel was possible but discouraged, practical only for those with skill, urgent need, or no alternatives. Most travelers wisely chose to rest, waiting for daylight to reveal the landscape once again and allow them to continue their journey safely. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the roads that shaped medieval travel. If tonight's journey helped you relax or taught you something new, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which part of medieval travel surprised you the most. Your messages help guide future stories. If you enjoyed this calm walk through history, remember to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next peaceful episode. Rest well, and I'll meet you in the next story.